There's a lot of different specialties in terms of what you could do as a future psychologist, but there are ones that are the most common, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to talk about the most common specialties that clinical psychologists will go into, just so you guys can have a general overview and idea of potentially what you could potentially do. What is up, fam? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Phil Sarpon. This is Phil's Guide to PsyD. This channel is dedicated to all things psychology, wellness, and graduate school. What I do my best on this channel is to answer any questions that you guys may have about graduate school to the best of my abilities. Today, we have a question about the most common specialties that clinical psychologists go into after graduate school or after their internship or after their postdoc. And one of the things that I've been able to try and research this out is, I've done a previous video about this in terms of all the different specialties through the APA in terms of the actual specialties of clinical psychology. And I think there's over 18 different specialties, and there's like over 3 or 4 different subspecialties. There's a lot of different specialties in terms of what you could do as a future psychologist. But there are ones that are the most common, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to talk about the most common specialties that clinical psychologists will go into, just so you guys can have a general overview and idea of potentially what you could potentially do after your PsyD or your PhD program. So one of the things that I've mentioned in previous videos is clinical psychology is in itself a specialty, and it's probably the largest specialty in the field in terms of clinical psychologists working in counseling centers, independent or group practices, hospitals, clinics. They assess, treat mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. You can do this by getting a PhD or a PsyD. There are also what's called cognitive and perceptual psychologists who study human perception, thinking, and memory. Now, what's interesting about this specialty is that you can do this not just with a PhD or a PsyD, but you could also do this with a master's. And so that is one thing to potentially look into. Next is counseling psychology. Seems to be really, really popular. They use various techniques that include interviewing, testing. They advise people on how to deal with problems. They are very similar to clinical psychologists. In fact, both clinical and counseling psychologists take the same licensure in order to get licensed. And so they are pretty much looked at as equivalent, but in terms of how they go about the training might be a little bit different in terms of clinical versus counseling psychology. Developmental psychologists are studying the physiological, cognitive, and social development that takes place throughout the life. Usually, you're going to find this in PhD programs and not necessarily specifically in PsyD programs. So that's just something to be aware of. Educational psychologists are people who conduct research on classroom dynamics, teaching style, and learning variables. They develop educational tests. They evaluate educational programs. And there's a lot of different degrees and certifications that you can get from this. So you can get a doctorate in education and work in some type of psychology department. And then you can get a PhD in psychology and then focus specifically on education. So there's a lot of ways to do this and go about this in terms of getting the degree. And so I'll definitely leave down some resources for you guys to check out if you guys are interested in that. The other thing is engineering psychology. So engineering psychologists conduct research on how people work best with machines. You can do this by either getting a PhD or a PsyD, but you can also do this by getting a master's degree. Finally, the last two things are experimental research psychology, which basically work in university and private research centers and in business, nonprofit, government organizations. They study behavior processes with human beings and animals such as rats, monkeys, and pigeons. So these guys are mainly working in the lab. They're not necessarily seeing patients or clients. They're mostly working on research and publishing and so forth. They may be doing some teaching as well. And finally, we have forensic psychologists who study problems of crime prevention, rehabilitation programs in prisons, courtroom dynamics. They also select candidates for police work. Now, one of the things that I will say about forensic psychology, This site mentions that you can only get it through a PhD. I will say that it's possible to also get it through a PsyD, but you have to choose specific practicum sites that are in sort of the forensic psychology realm. Maybe you work at a prison and so you're working with inmates, or you work with patients that have to deal with different law cases and stuff like that. So there are ways to get a forensic psychology experience or specialty if you go in the route of actually getting some practicum and clinical experience while you're in your graduate program. All right guys, so those are the most common psychology specialties that are out there that people are going into. If you found any one of those really interesting, or that you'd like me to do a further detailed review or information about that specific topic, put it down in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and with that, I will see you guys in the next video.